So I just got back from a 2-week trip to Mexico, and in this video, you'll learn some of the tips and tactics you can use to improve your Spanish fluency while you're traveling there. Hola, soy Andrés. Hi, I'm Andrew, y estudio español desde hace más de 20 años. And I've been studying Spanish for over 20 years. I've also been running a Spanish school for the last 10 years called Real Fast Spanish, which has helped over 3,000 students work towards their goals of conversational Spanish. Now, when it comes to traveling to a Spanish-speaking country, there are certain questions that students often ask me. Where should you go? Is it safe? How do you develop your Spanish while you're traveling? What if you can't understand what people are saying? What if you freeze when speaking Spanish? What if people always respond in English? And how do you make the most of the opportunity? So these are some of the main questions that come up. Without further ado, let's jump into it. Now, number one, where should you go? Is it safe? Now, for my trip, I spent a week around Puerto Vallarta with 7 of my friends from back home. I then spent a week in Mexico City by myself. Now, there was a meme that a few of my friends shared that week highlighting what people think Mexico is like and what it is actually like. And the joke is that yes, this is a country that has lots of beautiful areas, places to go, things to see, and amazing food to eat, there is still violence in certain areas, which is true. That said, if we compare Mexico to the US or Australia or any European country, there are parts in all of these places that you should avoid going, particularly alone or late at night. Now, the US, Canada, Australia, and most European countries have travel safety websites, and it's always important to check your local website whenever you're planning a trip in advance and just before you leave, because conflicts and unrest in certain areas can change in a very short time frame. That said, for us, Puerto Vallarta felt very safe. There were plenty of tourists and we heard lots of US accents. And while some people can complain about going to touristy areas, this can also be a good thing from a safety perspective. Now, one day we wandered into a tequila store and I was looking at the prices with my brother and we did a quick estimate and came to the conclusion that there was about $10,000 worth of tequila and mezcal on the shelves of this store. Now, we couldn't see any guards or heavy security, and so I was curious and I went up to the attendant who didn't speak much English and I asked, ¿Alguna vez han robado esta tienda? Like, has this store ever been robbed? And she told me that she'd been working there for 9 years and the store had never been robbed in that time. She said that she always felt safe in Puerto Vallarta going out with friends or walking alone at night. Also, one of the Mexican teachers who works in our Spanish school grew up in Guadalajara, and she told me that she spent most of her Christmas holidays in Vallarta when she was young, and she always considered it a safe place to go. Now, the interesting thing was that several locals asked me where I was going next, and I said Mexico City, and many warned me that it was much more dangerous than Vallarta because it's a big city. Now, I must admit, my first day in Mexico City, I was feeling quite nervous, but after walking around for a few hours in the neighborhood where I was staying, in a suburb called Condesa, I felt quite comfortable. Again, I heard a lot of US accents, and I saw people working with MacBooks in public parks. So I got the sense that there isn't a lot of crime in the area. Now, of course, in any major city, there are risks because there are lots of people, but I didn't feel less safe in Mexico City than I did in New York or London or LA. And for the record, I'd really like to go back to Mexico City as soon as possible. Next, how do you develop your Spanish while you're traveling? Something I've talked a lot about on this channel is the importance of learning as much as you can about the Spanish language, where the focus should be on sounds, vocabulary, and grammar. And when you're traveling, an important distinction that I recommend you think about is the difference between testing your Spanish and training your Spanish, where testing is about figuring out what you can and can't do with the language, and training is doing specific activities that are designed to improve your knowledge of the language. Now, it is very easy to go to a Spanish-speaking country such as Mexico and test your Spanish. You simply need to go up to someone and try to talk to them. If you can say what you want to say, then in essence, you've passed the test. And if you can't understand what someone says to you, then maybe theoretically you have failed that test and you move on. Whereas training, on the other hand, always results in learning something. So for any interaction you have while you're traveling, go in with the state of mind that you want to build your knowledge of Spanish. If you don't understand 100% of what someone says, or if you can't get out what you want to say properly, none of that matters as long as you are learning. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but if you learn a new word or a new phrase or you discover a new grammar rule, every time this happens, you are taking incremental steps towards fluency. And I would consider this a successful interaction, even if you don't understand everything that someone says. But with this in mind, what if you can't understand what people are saying? Now, as I mentioned, if your goal is to improve your knowledge and work towards fluency, it doesn't matter if you can't understand everything. You simply need to learn bits and pieces at every opportunity you have. That said, if you can't understand something, you have 3 choices. Number 1, you can ignore it, move on, and ask another question. Number 2, you can ask them to repeat themselves. And number 3, you can ask them to modify what they've said in some way. Maybe slow down or rephrase or spell a word or even change to English if they can. Now, the first is the easiest. If you're in a shop and the attendant is explaining something and you don't understand, but you want to learn about something else in the shop, you can just simply say, Bueno, dime un poco sobre esto. Okay, tell me a little bit about this. So you point their attention to another item and forget what you just missed. Now, you can also ask them to repeat themselves. Can you repeat that, please? ¿Puedes repetirlo, por favor? Now, it might simply be that if they say the same sentence again at the same speed, you might get it the second time. But then there could be a situation where you don't understand something, and even after they repeat, you still don't know what they said, but you really want to. When I was having lunch with my friends on the beach in a town called Bucerías between Sayulita and Puerto Vallarta, there were locals that were walking up and down the beach selling things to tourists. Now, while one of my friends was buying a bracelet for his girlfriend, I was chatting to one of the ladies and her 2 children. Now, they were trying to teach me words that I didn't recognize, and I asked them if the words were Spanish. And it turns out they were trying to teach me something about the indigenous language there. Now, I asked them to tell me the name of the language, and I couldn't understand it, so I asked them to repeat. When I Googled it, I still couldn't figure out what it was, so I asked, ¿Cómo se escribe? How do you spell it? Which is literally, how is it written? And they spelt this word, which they were pronouncing, Wirarica, which doesn't sound a lot like the way it's spelled, right? And that's because it's an indigenous language that I didn't recognize. Now, in my own experience, when you are curious and trying to learn, people don't mind repeating themselves, so it's okay to ask them to slow down, más despacio por favor, or to repeat, repítelo por favor. And if you are still struggling to understand and you really want to, you can ask if they speak English. ¿Hablas inglés? Now, even if they don't, they might have someone nearby that can translate for you. Now, again, for me, this is not a failure. If you learn what they just said by using English, it means you'll be able to better recognize it next time you hear it in Spanish. What if you freeze when you try to speak? Many years ago, my then girlfriend, now wife, and I went to a street party in Madrid with a few friends. At this party, several Spanish conversations were going on all at once, and people were talking over one another. Now, this can be a really difficult scenario just in general, but I remember we'd been studying Spanish all day, and in that moment, my brain just checked out. I froze and I couldn't speak Spanish, and I couldn't understand what people were saying to me. It was just, my brain was just, I don't know, it was done. At the time, it felt like I was failing. It felt like my Spanish sucked and I was never going to get good at it. So we left the party early, but the next day, after we got some sleep, we caught up with some of those friends and I was able to understand what they were saying and I was able to express myself again. Now, these days, as a Spanish teacher, I believe deeply in the importance of rest and being in a good state for learning. That night, we were tired. It had been a long day and there was a lot going on with multiple conversations. When you are physically tired and emotionally tired, it can be hard to perform. And if you're anything like me, the potential to freeze will go up in a moment like that. Now, if you do find that happening, it may simply be that you need to go away and get some rest, recover, sleep, and then come back the next day and try again. Now, all of that said, it could also be that freezing is not a result of fatigue. Maybe this happens even when you're feeling fresh. In this case, it's worth having some set Spanish phrases that you have practiced over and over that you can bring out in moments like this. Now, check out our video on filler words. I'll leave a link below. But in short, some examples of words like this would be things like pues, bien, bueno, es que, no lo sé, la verdad es que. Like, you can use phrases like these to fill the silence and give yourself time to think and come up with a Spanish word or phrase that you're looking for. You can even say things like necesito un momento, I need a moment, or tengo que pensar un poco, I have to think a little. Now, all of these phrases can help get some Spanish coming out of your mouth to build momentum to help you get out of that freeze moment so you can move forward again. Now, something else that can help with getting over the fear of freezing up is developing your confidence. And this can improve with more knowledge of Spanish, but not necessarily. Check out our video on developing confidence without learning more Spanish to see how you can work on this. Again, I'll leave a link below. Now, what if people always respond in English? A common situation many students have to deal with, and I've experienced too, is saying something to someone in Spanish and having them respond in English. Now, apart from being really frustrating, There are several reasons why this could happen. I remember several years ago, I was in a bar in San Sebastian, and this is when my Spanish was okay. I wasn't a beginner. And I said something to my wife in English like, hey, what do you want? And then I spoke to the waiter and I said in Spanish, whatever, quiero eso por favor. Now he responded to my Spanish in English. And so it was one of those situations where I thought, did I say something wrong? But I continued to respond in Spanish, and then he responded in English. Now, this happened repeatedly over the next hour or so. And eventually, I kind of broke a little bit, and I just said, he dicho algo mal, ¿qué pasa? Porque siempre me contestas en inglés cuando hablo contigo en español. Translating to English, it would have been something like, did I say something incorrectly? Like, what's going on here? Why do you keep answering me in English when I speak to you in Spanish? And he said to me, in English, because my boss is watching. I got this job because I speak English, and if he sees me speaking Spanish with English tourists, I'll be in trouble, and I don't want to lose my job. So in this case, it had nothing to do with my abilities, my word use, or my accent. He knew we were English-speaking tourists, so he had to speak to us in English. So clearly, some of the reasons why Spanish natives respond to you in English when you speak Spanish with them don't necessarily have anything to do with your abilities, and it could be that they have to do it for their job, they're trying to be good hosts, or maybe even they just want to practice their English. Now, these reasons have nothing to do with your ability, but then of course, it could be because they think that the conversation would be easier in English, or that they don't understand your Spanish. And of course, reasons 4 and 5 could be because of your Spanish skills. Now, these days, personally, it doesn't bother me if a waiter wants to respond in English. It did years ago, but these days I know the choice doesn't always have to do with me. Now, one thing you can do is just straight up ask questions about Spanish in English. Like you can say, did I say that phrase incorrectly? You can ask in English and they can respond in English and you can still learn something. Can you tell me what this word means? Or how do you pronounce this word? In this case, the waiter can answer the questions in English and won't lose his job, and you can still learn something. But then, of course, if the native is not forced to speak English for their job, you could ask, por favor, hablo conmigo en español, me encanta tu acento y estoy aquí para practicar. Please speak to me in Spanish, I love your accent, and I'm here to practice. Now, if that doesn't get them going back to Spanish, then find someone else. There'll be plenty of people you come across while you're traveling in Mexico that won't speak English. All right, how do you make the most of the opportunity? Now, as I've highlighted several times so far, the ultimate goal which will move you towards fluency is improving your knowledge. So take every moment you are traveling in Mexico or any other Spanish-speaking country as an opportunity to learn. Whether the conversation is in English or in Spanish or a mix, try to avoid a testing mindset where you're trying to figure out whether your Spanish is good enough or not to listen, to speak, to understand, whatever it is you're trying to do. Instead, always ask yourself, what can I learn about Spanish right now? And then write things down. I took lots of notes while I was there because I'm also always trying to improve my own knowledge. Take photos of signs, take photos of menus, and study them in your hotel. Take a notepad and use a note-taking app in your phone. Now, personally, I really like to use Ample Note, but there are plenty of note-taking apps out there that work just as well. Anything that will allow you to capture information so you can review it later will help you step closer and closer to fluency. Now, if you want to improve your fluency, whether you're traveling or you're at home, it's also important to apply the ideas in this video to help improve your ability to think in Spanish.